I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the different topics we'll be covering in the course. And so to that end, I've written a few of the topics down, although there will be others that will be integrated with these topics. As I've said, there are two major strands. One is the topics and the other one is the methodology or the frames. After I give an introduction which traces the history of educational research, in particular literacy research, from about the 1800s, but in reality I'll be making sometimes references to in the early part of the Greek philosophical tradition. So when I move into the 1950s, I'm really going to focus upon what was a preoccupation at that time, where people were looking for a silver bullet in terms of preparing people relative to reading. At this point in time, in the 1950s, the emphasis was on the teaching of reading, not the teaching of writing. People sort of had the belief that one first learned to read before one learned to write, which proved to be wrong, coming out of some of the research that was done in the 1960s and 1970s. But at the 1950s, after World War II, and what we were experiencing was the race in space, America in particular, but it was quite global. People were preoccupied in trying to pin down the sort of almost like the silver bullet. What was the best method of teaching reading? And while there are some people who are also focused upon adult reading and secondary reading and reading in content areas, a huge amount of money was being poured into seeing if in fact they could trace down what was the best method of teaching reading. And that preoccupied people through the 1960s. However, simultaneously with that, people were studying, observing reading, and it was coming from a couple of different sources. It was coming from people who were knowledgeable about linguistics, people who were interested in communication theory. And they started to try to understand a little bit more from the perspective of the meaning maker, the reader, what was going on as people were engaged in reading relative to their thought processes. This period was sometimes referred to as sort of the psycholinguistic period, where people were developing psycholinguistic theories, and one of them was sort of influenced by Chomsky at this point in time. And interesting development was Chomsky's attack on traditional linguistics. And I remember one of my colleagues, Ken Goodman, who was one of the leading psycholinguists back then, had been involved in conversations with Chomsky. And Chomsky and he ended up sort of viewing reading as somewhat akin to hypothesis testing. That as one read, one was sort of had hypotheses about what the meaning would be and what the words might be. We're making predictions, and their errors weren't so much errors in the incorrect sense or the mistake sense, but the kids' errors, like when they were reading orally, they might mispronounce a word or substitute another word, were really tied to their attempts to fit in words which made sense. And so coming out of this sort of period of understanding of what people might be doing linguistically, naturally in terms of linguistic processes, was the concept of reading as a psycholinguistic guessing game. I didn't really like the emphasis upon guessing because I thought it was a little bit more hypothesis-driven than guessing. But that work, I think, was a key work that was a precursor to what some people would say was one of the most significant turns of the last 50 years. And that was a cognitive turn. And we'll talk about that. There's a hugely significant aspect of that, is that sort of shifted from reading being something or other that people did by translating text, that reading or the meanings that one acquired when one read were created by the reader. That you, as a reader, are actively involved in meaning making, and that what you bring to the reading act, your understandings, your background knowledge, is instrumental, is huge, has a huge impact on your construction of meaning. And so that sort of cognitive type of thinking of meaning making going on actively by the reader was a key development in the field, which you will sort of see how it played out, and the type of research which in turn it influenced. I would say in education during this period of the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's no other area of education that was receiving more in terms of research dollars. And there were very few other areas of education, even totally, that were equivalent to the amount of research that was going on in reading. And in particular, the shift became one of not just looking at the beginning approaches to reading, but also looking at reading comprehension, where we began to believe that reading comprehension was actually something or other we could develop. It wasn't sort of inherently given to somebody genetically. So we'll be talking about the cognitive turn as we sort of move into the 60s and 70s. And then in the early 80s, a period that I was very much involved in, we saw a number of us who were trying to understand reading comprehension from the perspective of trying to understand the role of authorship, and became more and more interested in actually amalgamating again reading and writing, and beginning to sort of view the act of reading as sort of like an orphan child without sort of an understanding of what was going on in writing, and coming to realize that there was a major transaction that went on in learning to read in conjunction with also learning to write. This was a period in schools where we sort of see the shift in writing instruction quite significant. Something or other which was sort of taught mechanically to something or other that was taught much more in terms of a constructive enterprise. And we begin to see the integration of reading and writing in sort of powerful ways in schools, where kids were reading and writing almost pervasively during the day. I believe those developments were consistent with what I'd call the advent of literacies, where we really stopped talking about reading by itself and began to talk about reading and writing and literacies, reading and writing, speaking and listening and viewing, which proved to be a key precursor to the digital revolution. Because I think it was in the 80s that I, for example, was engaged with Apple Computer with the advent of hypertext, and where kids were being given access to integrating video in their written work in a multi-layered fashion, which was in a sense the precursor to the internet and the type of social media types of things that kids are doing these days with Instagram and so on. And so this advent of literacies through reading and writing, as I said, was a major precursor to another significant development in reading, which had become literacies to the digital era that we now find ourselves in, where we're not just using the digital as tools, we actually live in the media, which is an interesting way to begin to sort of think about this. We actually are engaged constantly around the clock in a sort of almost a media bubble. And you'll see how this sort of plays out when we talk about modern day populism, where people are talk about, particularly in the Trump era, of people being in the digital bubbles, in their echo chambers. And what does that mean for literacy when all people are hearing is what they want to understand? But anyhow, so you can sort of see in this period here the cascading effects that occur as we move to literacies. And we also move to another development which is hugely significant, and it might appear to be a minor turn, but it was major. And that was from the view that meaning making occurs in the head to meaning making actually occurs socially. That the meanings you hold are part of an interpretive community that you're participating in, or several interpretive communities, that the social dynamics are huge in terms of how one transacts meaning, whether it be a reader with an author, or whether it be people in discussion groups, or people in the age of feeling like they're part of the sort of the Twitter world of a collective. And so we see the social turn beginning to take place. And as you can imagine, what you've got going on here is also a major methodological turn. because no longer are you just focusing upon trying to understand the thought processes of an individual. You're also trying to map onto the thought processes of a group in conjunction with individuals as well. Well, all of these things are occurring at other interesting times because some of the political developments sort of fold into these turns. You have the rise of feminism, the rise of post-colonial research, and other sort of critical forms of looking at the world. And hand in hand with that, you've got a shift in research from being a study of somebody to a study with somebody, to people trying to figure out, well, how do I actually get involved in a form of activism research? So methodologically, you're seeing sort of major shifts from fairly controlled, in a sense, positivistic research to very much critical activism, participatory research occurring down here. And finally, as the course sort of moves towards its end, we'll talk also about the global developments, including modern day populism that we're sort of seeing occurring right now, the sort of almost anti-globalism, the rise again of nationalism and isolationism. But we will be sort of focusing upon the world. And I'd like to differentiate this here a little bit. This is not just from the perspective of a worldview. My hope is that you guys will begin to approach research in a worldly sort of fashion, where you have an understanding of others and ways of actually dealing with others, including, in particular, in different parts of the world. I think one of the most interesting developments are the developments and tenets of indigenous research. But what does it mean to actually be global? You know, to recognize that as a literacy researcher, you're not just focused upon the West and the developed world, but you also might be actually working with the developing world, with their needs, their agricultural needs, their food needs, their educational needs. But you're also trying to do it in a way that's developmental, not colonizing. And so the interesting thing is, I think to me, this is one of the most interesting spaces we're in right now, because the West is dominated, or the Northern Hemisphere is dominated, the South. And I think the most interesting thing here is sort of like how to actually shift from colonialism, which has prevailed in the world for hundreds and hundreds of years now, to a form which actually is development in an organic and ecological sense that actually rebuilds the diversity of ways of knowing that will actually enhance our global ecology in the long term. And so we'll focus upon these sorts of issues and some of the theoretical thinking that undergirds what I think is the current climate that we're dealing with at this point in time. And in conjunction with this, as I've sort of alluded, I'll try to bring in some of the modern day political issues that have emerged with the challenges that Europe's experiencing, the US experiencing, and the movement, the anti-free trade movement, and things such as that. So this is the calendar. I'm looking forward to it. I think these are incredibly exciting sorts of periods. These developments, to some extent, will correspond to the different weeks we'll be pursuing things. And as we deal with these developments, as I've indicated, you'll also see how our frames have shifted and how our methodology for delving into these issues have shifted. And I would hope that they inform your approach to your research, your thinking about how you're doing research with people, and how you're delving into what's going on both inside their heads and in the collectives, not only internationally but transnationally, and with a particular interest in sort of looking at these things globally in an ethical, activist, participatory sort of fashion.